Good morning, everybody. This is Srija from the team Voyages into the Past or Otit Prabaho. Today, Voyages into the Past is honored to have among us Mr. Sohail Hashmi, who is going to give a lecture on the topic: Is the Mughal garden inspired from Quran or was there a different impetus? Mr. Hashmi is graduated from DU and completed his post-graduation and MPhil from JNU. He has worked among the unorganized youth, headload workers, resettlement colonies, and trade unions for 10 years. Then he has moved into the electronic media. Currently, he is one of the trustees of Sahmat, that is the Safdar Hashmi Memorial Trust, and he has also worked with PTI TV, Home TV, Kingfisher.com, etc. He loves to make documentaries and write blogs on issues of communalism, language, education, women's rights, literacy, lesser known freedom fighters, etc. He is famous for his documentary Urdu Hai Jiska Naam. Other than this also, he has done several documentaries and he's working on several documentaries. Mr. Hashmi conducts heritage works in Delhi and he writes about his travels, architecture, food, and everything which interests him. Today, we all are very eager to listen to you, sir. So let's get started. Over to you.
Thank you, Sreja. Thank you for this opportunity. And I must say, it's a great honor to be invited by your online platform, which has seen some very eminent historians to have come and spoken. I'm not a historian. I have trained as a geographer, but I have an interest in history. And having studied geography, I try to look at things as they are spread across land, and also try to see how geography impacts our lives. So it is from this that I have started looking at many of the popularly held positions among history, and one of which is what I want to place before you, this entire question of the Mughal garden. And I'm just going to remove myself from this screen, and I'll present to you a PowerPoint, a slideshow with images. And once I'm through, then I'll come back, and then we can have question and answers. So thank you very much. I'll now remove myself. Srija, you'll need to tell me if my screen is visible.
Okay. Okay.
Is my screen visible to you?
No, sir, it is not visible. It is now not visible.
Not yet.
No.
Okay. Is it visible now?
Yes, it is coming.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, it is
Okay.
coming.
So here goes. So my presentation is, as Srija has already informed you, about the Mughal gardens and the idea if the Mughal gardens were inspired by the Quran. The presentation that follows would seek to examine a popularly held belief about the Mughal gardens. The popularly held belief is that Mughal gardens represent the epitome of Islamic aesthetics and are inspired by the Garden of Eden as described in the Quran. This is the popularly held belief, and most writings on the Mughal garden begin with this premise, and they keep on uh, articulating this through there's a large number of works, very scholarly works that have been done. But this is the assumption on which the entire uh, argument of how do you look at the Mughal garden is placed. In this presentation, we would try to explore three things. A, what is the Quranic description of the Garden of Heaven? What informed the Quranic idea of the Garden of Heaven? And is there something unique about this description? So these are the three things that we would try to look at through the presentation. So first, the Quranic description of the Garden of Heaven. Now, as all of you know, Islam was born in Arabia. And Arabia is primarily desert, except for the coastal area. Most of Arabia is desert. This is the map of Arabia, and if you can see my cursor, this is Arabia. And even in this image, you can see there is very little green. These are the bits where proximity to the ocean gives some relief, otherwise it is desert. These are four images from the birthplace of Islam near Mecca. This is Mount Arafat, or in Arabic known as Jabal al-Rahma, which is in near Mecca.
Excuse me, sir. Sorry for
Yes.
this interruption, but your slides are not moving, sir.
Slides are not moving.
Yeah.
We are still stuck at the first slide.
Yes, sir.
Then what do we do?
Sir, please go to the PowerPoint and just try to change the slides.
I'll have to stop sharing first. Go back. This is the Shall we give up the idea of trying to run a PowerPoint?
No, sir, you can do, like, if you want to share again, do that same procedure. I think there were some technical glitches. That's why that's got stuck. It's okay, there is no problem.
Can you see the screen now?
No, it is not coming.
No, you can't. Okay, share screen, window, share. Now can you see it?
Yes, it is coming. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now tell me if the slides move.
Yes.
Are the slides
Yes,
moving now?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It is moving.
They are moving now?
Yes, sir. Yes.
So,
sir, you can continue. You can now continue.
and so instead of going to full screen, I'll do it like this.
Okay, that is better. If you think that is comfortable, then you can do it.
Okay, because everybody is watching on their screen, so I don't think there shouldn't be a problem. Going full screen apparently is creating this problem.
Okay, sir. No issue.
Okay. So, so we were at slide 3. Mughal gardens represent the epitome of Islamic aesthetics and are inspired by the Garden of Eden, as described in the Quran. Now, as I was saying, we are going to explore these three things. What is the Quranic description of the Garden of Heaven? What informed the Quranic idea of the Garden of Heaven? And is there something unique about this description? Now, as you can see, this is, can you see my cursor moving? Srija?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We can see that.
Can you see the cursor
Yes,
on
sir.
the screen? Yeah, all right.
Yes, yes.
So this is Arabia, but what is now known as Saudi Arabia. And these are images from area near Mecca. There is a project that is working there called permaculture, where they are trying to create a situation where uh, a, uh, vegetation can be grown in this kind of harsh climate, and enough vegetation that can sustain the resident population there. So these are images from that project, and the link I have given beneath, permaculturenews.org. And so there you can and there is quite a lot of material, but you can see that I just wanted to pick up some images to give you an idea of the kind of landscape where Islam was born. So this is Mount Arafat, which is has a central position in the myth of Islam. And these are areas, the three other images are areas around Mecca. And you can see the kind of stark landscape that is there. All of it is not so colorless, but when it is not so stark rocky, it is like this sandy terrain that you see here, or this is the Wadi Rum, and this is an image from the Arab News. The first two images were from Encyclopedia Britannica. I'll keep on mentioning the images from where I've taken them. Where I do not mention the source, they are all photographs taken by me. So this is the kind of stark landscape in which Islam took birth. Now, try to imagine. I don't know how many of you have had the occasion to travel to the Rajasthan desert, and not the cities like Jaipur and Udaipur, but in the desert itself, in the Thar. If any one of you has been there, or if you have an idea of what what the desert looks like while you're traveling from Jaipur to Udaipur, or from Udaipur to Jaisalmer, or to these places, or to Ranthambore, you will have some idea of what the desert is like. Now try to place yourself there in the month of June, and in that situation, and the Saudi Arab, the desert of Arabia gets far hotter than the desert of Thar. But try to imagine yourself in the Thar desert in Rajasthan at the peak of summer. And then if somebody was to ask you, we want to turn this place into heaven, what would you want? What would you say? You would say, I need trees that give me shade, and I want water and cold streams of water, and I want trees that give me shade, and I want trees that give me fruit. That is what somebody in the desert would imagine heaven to be. That is precisely what the Quran promises you in heaven. Streams of running water, they've added milk and honey. Trees that give you shade, trees that give fruit. And what are the trees mentioned? Dates, figs, olives. There are a couple of other trees, some citruses. But that's it. They don't mention mangoes. They don't mention guava. They don't also mention snow, snow-covered peaks, because this was not their imagination. You see, unless you believe that this is a revealed text, then we are not talking history, then we are talking mythology. But if look at it at historically, The idea of heaven as presented in the Quran is the imagination of somebody who lives in the desert. I'm not saying that this is an idea purely of the Prophet. Even before that, in mythology, in their fables, in their myths, they would have a description of heaven. And all that informs the idea of heaven as presented in the Quran. And you know what happens in a desert when you get running water? Where you have a little lake, natural lake, a village grows around it, and people plant trees. So you have running water and you have trees, and and this is what it is. This is a heritage village in Saudi. You see water, you see the date trees, and you see some other trees. You can make out from the shape that they belong to the family of acacia, the kind of tree that you see here. Gnarled trunks and a mesh of branches and very few leaves. That is the kind of trees that you have here. It is from this that the idea of heaven is developed. Now, so the idea of heaven as presented in the Quran is essentially the following: trees that give you shade and fruits, streams of sweet water, and that's it. You can add honey and milk and all that, but essentially this is what heaven was. And this was heaven for anybody who lived in the dark, in the hot, sandy climate of Saudi Arabia, of Arabia, without a twig of grass for miles. That is what they imagined heaven to be. Now we are expected to believe that gardens built by Mughals were informed by this idea of heaven. There are a few other trees that appear in the Quran. They mention pomegranate. Walnut is supposed to have been mentioned by the Prophet while explaining a tree in heaven to somebody. And in order to explain to him what it would look like, he said it looks like the walnut, but like a huge walnut. And the man did not know what the walnut tree was. So he said it grows far away in that country. Pumpkin is mentioned. And a shrub, the leaves of which have a salty secretion and is known as salt cedar. But in Arabic, it is known as tamarisk. And there are two other trees. One is the tree of heaven called the tuba, and there is zakam, which is a tree from hell. The cedar tree has also been mentioned, and it has been compared to a hypocrite, because it says that the devoted, the believer, always bends down in the face of strong winds or oppression and all that, because he bends down to pray to God. In the face of oppression, or in the face of tyrannic rulers who are tyrants, a believer would bow down to God. But a cedar tree, like a hypocrite, and I don't know how you can explain that, but that is the description, does not bend, and therefore it has to be uprooted totally. Which is a strange kind of a description, but there it is. And then there are, again, quoting the Prophet, somebody has said that the Prophet said, you should not enter a mosque after having consumed garlic, onions, and leeks, because after eating them, there is the strong odor, the smell of these vegetables. Uh, you can smell it if somebody has just eaten garlic. And the Prophet is believed to have said that humans don't like this kind of odor coming from somebody's mouth, and obviously the angels will also not like it. So don't eat garlic, onion, and leeks before entering the mosque. So these are prohibited. Incidentally, the Brahmins in India also banned garlic, onion, and leeks. What is the connection? One doesn't know. Probably the fact that all these three were alien to India, and garlic, onion, and leeks were also alien to Arabia. They came from Egypt. Now, this I have already said, but I am restating. The Garden of Eden is the imagination of a dweller of the desert. The desert, the desert had only 5 trees. At least that is the description in the Quran. The other two are one from hell and one from heaven. Now we come to the Mughals. The first Mughal garden was built by Babur, and the birthplace of Babur is the Farghana Valley. That is also the site of the first Mughal garden. Let me place it geographically first. To the northwest, you have Kazakhstan. To the south, you have Tajikistan. To the east, you have Kyrgyzstan. And to the west, you have Uzbekistan. The Farghana Valley is divided, it is essentially within Uzbekistan, but it borders Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. And this is the Farghana Valley. And this is where Babur was born. This is a painting of Babur out hunting, and you can see there is some musicians there, and he's sitting on a carpet, and some geese have been hunted, and the hunter is bringing some of that, and you can see those rocks which have this typically Chinese kind of thing. With the Persian miniatures had quite a lot of influence of the Chinese tradition, because miniature painting eventually arrived in Central Asia through the Silk Route from China, and also the medium on which the paintings were made was paper, and paper was invented by Chinese. So you have quite a lot of those influences in the Persian paintings. Now, but anyway, that is not something that is going to engage us today. The purpose of this is to show you where Babur was born. This is the Farghana Valley. This is Farghana Valley. This is Farghana. This is Farghana. This is a roadside mart of fruits. And the 4 trees that you see in the back, these are all mulberry trees. I was in Uzbekistan recently, and I discovered that they dry the mulberry fruit and they eat it through the year, because the season in which mulberry is available is very short, end March, beginning April, and then it disappears. So they pluck them and they dry them, and then you can buy mulberry, both varieties, the white and the dark color, through the year. So Why I'm showing you these images is to underscore the fact that the imagination of the garden that the Mughals carried with them is born in this land and not here or here. Because the imagination of this area of a garden will be this. Babar and his descendants came from here, from this stunningly beautiful valley. And therefore, in their imagination, a garden would be something totally different. Babar built the first garden in Fargana. He conquered Fargana when he was 14 years. And there were two mountain spurs, and in the middle of which there was a mountain stream. And he created terraces along that stream and planted fruit-bearing trees and flowering shrubs. Unfortunately, he lost. And then he captured Kabul a couple of years later, and he built a garden there. And the idea of the Mughal garden that he carried with him, the idea of the garden, which came to be known as the Mughal garden, that Babar carried with him from Fargana, was then repeated in Kabul, which is again the same kind of landscape, not as fertile, not as beautiful as the Fargana Valley, but still mountain terrain, cold climate, and if you found a mountain stream, there you had it. The Mughal garden was created by someone who grew up in the fertile valley. The Mughal garden drew upon the garden building traditions of Turkey and Persia that were in their turn informed by Sumerian and Babylonian traditions. Bagh-e-Babur. Bagh-e-Babur is the place where Babur is buried. He left a will that he should be buried in his own garden, and that's why he was originally buried at Agra, and then his remains were removed and taken to Kabul. And this structure of marble in the middle is the mausoleum of Babur. Incidentally, the marble went from Rajasthan and the stone masons went from Rajasthan. This mausoleum was very badly damaged during the years of the war in the 80s and 90s. And some years ago, about 10 years ago, the Afghanistan government requested the government of India to help them restore the mausoleum of Babur. And once again, marble from Makrana and stone masons from Rajasthan went to Kabul to rebuild and restore the mausoleum. So this is the mausoleum, and this mausoleum sits at the head of a stream. This is the water cascade that has been created. These are natural, this is a hill. And Babur created these terraces in the hill and created these steps, and the water flowed down naturally. Now, this is the idea of the garden. That you have these terraces, you have water flowing and water falling as it does in the mountains. This is central to the idea of the Mughal garden. My submission is that this idea does not have its origins in the Quran. This idea has its origins in mountainous terrain of Uzbekistan, of the Fargana Valley, and of Kabul, Afghanistan. This is the mausoleum of Babur, and you can see these steps, the terraces, and the gardens that he built on those terraces. This is the idea of the garden that the first Mughal, brings to India. Unfortunately, once he is into India and he has defeated the Lodhis, he finds himself in the endless flat plains of the Indo-Gangetic Valley. And that is where the Mughal garden begins to play out. But remember, the Mughal garden was built around a cataract, a mountain stream rushing down natural slopes. You didn't have that in North India. So, what they did was to create these water channels, create levels, create terraces. Babur, this is the first garden built by Babur in Agra, Bagh-e-Gulafshan, to which later Jahangir added and Noor Jahan added. And Jahangir renamed it as Bagh-e-Noor Afshan. And Bagh-e-Gulafshan means flower scattering garden. And Jahangir renamed it Bagh-e-Noor Afshan, which is a play on his queen's name, Noor Jahan. But Noor is also holy light, the kind of light that emanates from the halo of the prophets and so on and so forth, the divine light. So this he named as the Bagh-e-Noor Afshan. In later years, the garden came to be known as Aram Bagh. And in 1967, I think, when the earlier incarnation of Bharatiya Janata Party, which was known as the Bharatiya Janasangh, came to control the Agra Municipal Corporation, they renamed the garden from Aram Bagh. They dropped the A and they named it Ram Bagh. They are past masters at that. All they do is change names. So this is not something that was invented by Mr. Modi. He has uh, very illustrious predecessors in his tradition who have been doing it. But anyway, so these channels were created. Babur got lakhs of tons of earth dumped here, reversed the slope of the land because this was built on the bank of the river. Land naturally tapered towards the ground, towards the river. He got so much earth dumped here in the garden area that the slope was reversed, and then he created terraces. Then he lifted water from the river through Persian wheels and two huge wells on which he erected Persian wheels, and then the water would flow through these channels. So he created these terraces. What is he trying to do? He's trying to create the flow that was there naturally in the mountains, in the garden of Fargana and the garden of Kabul. Here, because he got a flat land, he created these different levels, the terraces, so that the water could flow, and it doesn't stop there. If you happen to go to this garden, outside there's a huge tablet which gives you a list of trees that Babur imported from Afghanistan and from Fargana to be planted here. Apricots, plums, pomegranates, you name it. Large number of fruits that we consume today were introduced to India by the Mughals. And they were all planted here, but none of them survived because of the harsh climate. But this idea of creating these water channels and terraces, which was first tried by Babur here, continued. And this is another image. Those two pavilions that you see at the back, they were built by Jahangir, added to Babar's garden by Jahangir. And both of them have underground chambers, and they border the river. The river is behind, is to the north of this image. And so if you were in those underground channels next to the river, they remained very cool. And that is why they were built, because the Mughals had very low tolerance of the kind of heat that Agra and Fatehpur Sikri and Delhi have in the summer months. So they were looking for methods of escaping the heat, and these underground rooms, and they were large spaces were created, and between these two pavilions there was a large water tank filled by water lifted from the river, and the water lifted from the river also flowed through all these channels. Now this tradition of these gardens and these channels continues. So Jahangir's mausoleum in Lahore has this garden outside. This is the mausoleum of Jahangir. This is not such a grand structure as, but inside it is stunningly beautiful. And this is what it looks like in the in the season of spring. And the season of spring in Lahore is the same as the season of spring in Delhi, which is February, March. So that is what it looks like. This is not my photograph. This is taken by Azad Saeed, and this is available on Commons Wikimedia. This is a rather uncared for Mughal garden. This is the mausoleum of Noor Jahan, also in Lahore. This is the Shalamar Garden or as they call it, and we in India we call it the Shalimar. We have a Shalimar Garden in Srinagar, and this is a Shalimar Garden in Lahore, both built by Jahangir. And you see the pavilions, you see the cascade, you see the water bodies and the water channels. These are all things that have those connections to the first garden that Babar had built. Now, but as long as they are in the plains in North India, they have to create these artificial slopes to have the idea of flowing water and terraces and all that. And then they reach Kashmir. And Kashmir, I believe, is a homecoming for them, because they found exactly the same kind of climate, exactly the same kind of landscape, and many of the fruits that they were used to could grow here. And so they introduced all of those fruits to Kashmir. And so I'll show you now the contrast. Now Kashmir, as I'm saying, is a homecoming. You will see how closely it is, how very similar it is to the landscape of Farghana. Actually better. With the coming of spring, the snows melt. Wild grasses and a profusion of tiny flowers cover the land. These photographs I was taken. We were just driving from Srinagar to Pampore, and I said stop, and we went into the field, and this is what you saw. And this is early spring, and then this I have never seen green flowers, and that the entire field was filled with these stunningly beautiful flowers, green in color. And then you have mustard flowers as far as the eye can see. I've large number of photographs. I've tried to compress some of them together in one frame so that you get an idea, though it is a bad compromise because you don't get to see the details. But this is what it looks like. It is just breathtaking. And this is one place where you have tulips growing in the wild. I don't know when these tulips arrived here uh, because they were probably introduced by the Europeans. And incidentally, tulips have their origins in Turkey. And in Turkish or Persian, they are known as gulelala. And from there, they travel to Europe. And now Turkey imports, and the world imports tulips from Holland. So, and Kashmir now has a huge garden, tulip garden, which has been developed over the last 10 years or so. But these tulips that I'm talking about, they grow in the wild. They were probably they were imported by the English, or maybe earlier they were there, and then some bulbs were left and they grew wild. This is the place where the famous saffron of Kashmir grows. And once the saffron is harvested, then uh, the wild tulips replace the plants of saffron, and this is what you get to see. And this is also for miles you can see. This is unlike the rows upon rows of disciplined tulips that you would see in tulip gardens. This is how they grow. So there are all kinds of varieties, white and mixed and red, growing together. But it is a stunning sight. So this is the landscape that the Mughals chance upon once they enter Kashmir. And then they begin to build their gardens. They are all over. They are all over. Every Mughal king who went to Kashmir built gardens. And I am just going to show you some images from the Shalimar. This is a peach tree in bloom. These are tiny little flowers which carpet, which grow like a carpet in the grass. I'm not joking. That is how it is. This is inside the Shalimar garden. The snows have just melted about 15 days ago, 15, 20 days ago. And this is what you get to see. This is the iris, which also grows wild all over. And in the middle of all that, you have this pavilion, and you have this water connecting that pavilion to this pavilion, the water flowing through the pavilion. I'm not showing you the architectural details of the pavilion because that is an entirely different area of exploration. The water that runs through Shalimar begins at the base of the mountain that I showed you, that you see looming behind this peach tree. This is at the base of this mountain that a stream begins, which flows through all these terraces and all this that you see. See the water rush. There are, these levels are natural slopes. They have just given them this shape, and they have built this. There's water behind this comes from a higher level. The water behind the other pavilion that you saw at the other end of this, this. Then there is, so this, behind that there is water, and behind that there is another terrace, and water just keeps flowing through these 5 or 6 terraces till it eventually falls into the Dal Lake. You see this? This is one level, this is second level, this is the third level, this is the fourth level, this is the fifth level, this is the sixth level. That is one pavilion. So this is the idea of the Mughal garden, and I fail to see how you can push this as the imagination, as something that is inspired by that very skin and bone description of the Garden of Eden that you find in the Quran. The Arab tradition of garden building was also informed by many of these traditions. Which tradition am I talking about? The Turkish, the Persian, and before that, the Sumerian, the Babylonian, which the Mughals inherited through their connections with the Turks, because after the Mongols had stopped looting the then known world and had begun to settle down, they settled down in the area which is known as Turkmenistan, and they acquired a whole lot of Turkish culture and tradition. Babar incidentally used to write his poetry in Turkish. So that was one abiding influence on the Mongols, who later came to be, thanks to the English, came to be known as Mughals. And Babar's maternal grandmother's family is descended from Changiz, and his paternal grandfather's family is descended from Tamerlane. So, and that's why they call themselves the Timurids, of the Timurid tradition. And these people had settled down in that area, and from there they then moved into what is now known as Uzbekistan. So they were Mongols with mixing of Turkish traditions, and then Uzbek, and from Humayun's time, there was serious inputs of the Persian tradition. These these traditions were culturally far more evolved than the Arabic tradition, which was essentially very few cities and primarily hunting and gathering and uh, animal rearing. The Bedouins used to do that. The The Iranian tradition was far more rich. They had tradition of cities and of hundreds, thousands of years earlier, and which had connections to the uh, earlier Persian and Turkish traditions, which go back a long time. So it is these that inform the uh, cultural heritage of the Mughals. In their food, music, attire, literary expression, they drew upon the Persian tradition. In their praying, they used Arabic because they had converted to Islam. Once these territories were conquered by the uh, expanding armies of Muslims, many of these people were converted to Islam. And because they had become Muslim now, so and they prayed in the language of the Quran, but that was it. They prayed in Sanskrit. You pray in Sanskrit, the rituals of Brahmanic worship are in Sanskrit. But all those people across the length and breadth of this country, can we say that their culture and their life and everything is inspired by the Sanskrit tradition? Qazi Nazrul Islam, if he prayed, he would pray in Arabic. But can you say that his cultural imagination was informed by the Arabic culture? Similarly, the Mughals, who expressed themselves literary, their literary expression was Turkish or uh, Persian. Their food was informed by these traditions. Their clothes, their attire, their music was informed by these traditions. Why would their architecture be informed only their architecture and their sense of the garden? Why would that be informed by the traditions of the Quran? I fail to see this. And the evidence is totally to the contrary. I have tried to show you how it is inspired by the gardens of Farghana in Kabul. And what the Mughals were trying to do all the time was to get back that kind of an ambience. And once they reached Kashmir, they found it, and you see what they did. So that is all I have to say about this. And if we have any questions, we can take them now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. It was an amazing session, and the pictures especially were beautiful. So I request Anirbanda that if there is any question, please show.
Have I taken more time than was allotted to me? I think I have.
No, 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 no. That is okay. Okay. So the question is from. Okay, there is a question that how the concept of charbak, that is the flow of honey, water, wine, and milk, came to incorporate with this culture.
You see, I think that the idea of the charbagh Sorry, I should have talked about it. I missed it. Uh, you see, the fourfold division is there in every culture. In every culture, the Brahmanic system divides the entire humanity into four: the Brahman, the Kshatriya, the Vaishya, and the Shudra. According to the Brahmanic tradition, the lifespan has to be divided into four: Brahmacharya, Grahast, Vanprasth, and Sannyas. So you will find this division of four in all religions. And it stems again from conditions of our existence: the rising sun in the east and the setting sun in the west, north and south. It is these four cardinal directions which lead you to these four, this thing, the cross. You know, you see the fourfold division of, it is there in your life all the time. So this is the origin of the fourfold division of the garden also.
So, do you think this division, this fourfold division, is common in almost in every religion, or is it
Yes.
much more specific to this religion, these two
No,
religions
no,
only?
no, 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 no. It is common to all religions. There is a tradition which is, now the month of fasting among the Muslims has become 30 days. But
Mm-hmm.
there is a tradition among Muslims of you go into seclusion and you pray for 40 days.
Okay.
Okay. Why 40? It's a multiple of 4. The season of Lent in Christianity is 40 days.
Yeah.
Jews also have this, a 40-day
Yes.
observance. Okay. When somebody dies, large in part of Indian communities, you have something on the 40th day of the death, Chaliswa.
Mm.
So you just think of this, and there are other things. We have 4 limbs, 2 hands, and 2 feet. So there are these connections to the 4 which are there everywhere,
So you
and
term
it
this
is,
as a coincidence, right? Like
yeah,
this is something which is pure coincidence, right? Like
yes,
this is somehow became related with our religion, with all the
but
religions to be more specific.
but religious beliefs, what is that? How do they come into existence? Originally, when we were still in the hunting and gathering stage, and our tribal communities, and Bengal is not, Delhi unfortunately has become too urbanized, but Bengal, there are tribal communities, and many of you must be familiar with their rituals and all that. All tribal communities all over the world were animists. And
Yes.
what does animism mean? Animists believe that everything has life, everything is animated. And that is why tribal communities were the best protectors of nature, because they took from nature only that was essential for their survival and not more. They did not cut trees, they only took dry branches, etc., etc., because they believed there is a spirit of the forest, there is a spirit of the tree, there is a spirit of the stream, of the rock, of the mountain. This major agitation that happened in Odisha, on that hill that was going to be dug up for bauxite, and the tribals resisted, and finally that Indonesian company had to pull out. because that mountain was their god.
Hmm.
So all primitive societies, they saw the divine in their surroundings, in the forest, in the river, forces of nature that were bigger than them. That is how all religions were born. North and south, the rising of the sun and the setting of the sun, these large two bodies that appear to be moving through the sky, the sun and the moon. In every religion, they have been given divine significances. It is coincidental, but the coincidence is in all around you. So that is how religions were born. Now, unless you believe that God created heaven and earth in 7 days, there is evidence to the contrary. You know, so unless you believe that there are revealed books and that there is some God somewhere who reveals, who tells people what to do, in real fact, what we believe in has roots in our surroundings, our religious practices. For example, the idea of one all powerful God, where is it first born and is first articulated? In the desert, Judaism. The
Yes.
same, the same idea is replicated by Jesus and then by Islam. All these three religions are born in the desert. Now, I think that it wouldn't have been too much of a problem for one God to manage the life in the desert. There wasn't much to manage. But one God couldn't look after the phenomenal diversity of India. 30,000 kinds of insects. You look at the profusion of vegetation and so on and so forth. You had to have so many gods. There, one God was enough. He was in charge of birth and death and because there was just desert and 4 trees. If you dig deep, you will see some very interesting connections. The idea of rebirth doesn't exist in the Semitic religions.
Okay.
Judaism, Islam, and Christianity don't believe in rebirth. Every other religion in the world almost believes in rebirth. Why? I think that the reason is that the founders of these three religions were not farmers. The idea of rebirth is born from agricultural practices. You plant a seed,
Interesting. Yes.
it grows, the grasses,
Hmm.
it fruits, and then the tree dies. And you have dead seed in your hand. And you plant it again, and a new tree comes. I think the idea of rebirth has its origins in settled agricultural practices.
That is really
So
interesting.
I'm saying that the way we imagine God, the universe, this, that is informed by our immediate surroundings, our geographical conditions, and the conditions of our existence. It is that informs our religious beliefs. So I don't know whether I've been able to answer your question, but I think that is how I look at it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So next question. This is from Aditya Shankar Chattopadhyay. So, what measures should we take to preserve these Mughal gardens? Did the careless mentality of few tourists harm these places, as various archaeological sites are also ruined by the same carelessness of the tourists?
Well, I think this is it is not such a simple thing. It is not only the carelessness of the tourists, which is there. I'm not
Hmm.
saying that that doesn't exist, but I think it is something which is far more deep rooted. As a people, we don't really care for heritage. You see, we have been told systematically for quite a while that all these Mughal gardens, the Red Fort, the Qutub Minar, the Mausoleum of Humayun, and all these things, they are not our heritage. They were
Yes.
built by invaders. Okay, this has been drilled in our heads from childhood. These were built by aggressors, etc., etc. And what is our heritage? Our heritage is 5,000 years old, and you don't find it because very few structures, man-made structures, unless they are pyramids, hang around for 5,000 years. So that is one. We don't really care for heritage. We have an idea of a past which does not exist because it is a imagined past. That past that we
But
keep on saying, our
but
great past.
we often find this that there are very young people like us who want to do something to preserve these things, but we don't get that much help, or what to do we don't know.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
to whom
yeah,
to
yeah.
approach. To we are just grad students, right? Or
I know,
we are
I know,
from
I know,
master's
I know. So,
students.
so, so, but I
So
was, I was just talking about the
hmm,
overall
hmm,
thing. But
hmm,
deep down, there are a large number of people who are
hmm,
seriously worried about how to protect heritage.
hmm,
Now, one problem is our own national mechanism of protection. The Archaeological Survey of India was created in the 1880s by the Brits. I don't have to tell you, people, students of history from Bengal, the first battle of the first major victory of the British was the Battle of Palashi,
classic.
1757. And when was the Archaeological Survey of India set up? 1880, 130 years later. What was happening in these 130 years? Unbridled loot. You would have read about Clive,
Hmm,
the wealth he carried away, and each one of those fellows between 1770 to 1880s, everything that could be physically removed was taken away. Then the British decided to preserve what remained. What couldn't be taken away, they said, all right, let us preserve it here. They set up the criteria. They decided what needs to be preserved. The Archaeological Survey of India will only protect structures, monuments, which, according to the Archaeological Survey of India, had archaeological, architectural, or historical importance. The other structures could be cared for by provincial departments of archaeology or by the municipal authorities. Now I'll tell you how it actually uh, worked out. In 1920, Delhi had 3,000 listed structures. 3,000. Delhi alone. 3,000 listed structures brought out in a list by the Archaeological Survey of India. So known as the Zafar Hasan list. This is 1920. In 2010, 90 years later, Archaeological Survey of India revisited that list. They could not find 1,000 structures. In 90 years, 1,000 listed structures have disappeared in Delhi alone. I know at least 30, 40 of them which have been converted into temples. You keep on writing about it, you keep on drawing the attention of the Archaeological Survey of India. They go to court, nothing happens. Nothing happens. So that is the other problem. Because the criteria have been established by the British and we continue to follow the same criteria. Today, of the 2000 structures in Delhi, only less than 20% are preserved. About 20%. 78% listed structures in Delhi out of the 2000 that remain are even today not protected. So people do what they want to do. They level them, they build temples on them, they include them in their park, and the official authorities do it. On the remains of the wall of Siri, the Delhi Development Authority leveled it overnight and built a tennis court for the Commonwealth Games. Despite protest of the neighbors, people who lived there, who knew that this is archaeologically important. The DDL they brought in bulldozers at night. They leveled it and built a tennis tennis court overnight. Nothing happened. So, for young people like those who are interested, I would say band together, create your organizations and build pressure. For example, there is this area, if I'm not mistaken, Entali in Calcutta, where the Italians came and lived earlier. That's why it is called Entali. And some distance away from there, there is a Christian graveyard, Christian cemetery. And some very, very old, beautiful graves are there. And they are in a very bad shape. I would say that, as an experiment, or pick up one site like that on behalf of the history department of your college. Find out who are the caretakers. Tell them that we want to help preserve this. Go out in the city, raise money. Contact the INTAX, say, please, we are going to raise money, we are going to help, we are going to volunteer. Pick up 1, 2, 3 monuments and begin. That might actually activate some of your parents. You still might have contacts in your schools. Ask your schools to adopt one building in their locality and say we are going to preserve it and we are going to protect it. Then this can be converted into a mass movement. Bengal has a tradition of these kind of mass movements. We can do it. And if the youth of Bengal gets down to this, things can change. Things can change very, very rapidly. But we have to stop relying on our governments. We have to put pressure on them. On their own, they will not do this. They have other more pressing things to worry about than heritage. Yeah.
That is the sad part.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have another question. This is from Sujata Chakraborty.
Yeah.
Sir, it's honor to ask questions. My question is the style was influenced by Persian gardens, particularly the Charbagh structure. Charbagh is a Persian and Indo-Persian quadrilateral garden layout based on 4 gardens of paradise mentioned in Quran. Is not there a assimilation between Indian and Persian tradition?
Certainly. You see, Char is, we call it Char Bagh. In the Persian tradition, it is Chahar Bagh. Chahar is Persian for 4. So in the very nature of the layout of these gardens, of the Mughal gardens in India, it had to have Indian elements in it. Because the stone that was being used for building the walls and the fountains was Indian stone. It was not the stone that you found in Uzbekistan. This stone behaved differently. It had a different hardness. It reacted differently to water than the rocks in Uzbekistan would do or in Afghanistan would do. So obviously, the seasonal flowers that you planted here were flowers that grow in this area. You know, so the kind of intermixing that has taken place is phenomenal, and that is why I have been saying that to insist that you see something that I have not touched upon on this earlier. Where does this idea originate from? That the idea of the Mughal garden is rooted in the Quran. Who first thought of this? Why? I am absolutely convinced that this idea is the creation of the colonial scholar, of the so-called Indologist. Because you are students of history, they created a history, they divided our history. How did they divide it? The Hindu period, the Muslim period, and the
Yes,
British
yes.
period. Why was
Three
not?
parts.
Why was the third period not the Christian period? It should have been the Christian period.
Because British tried to influence like their name, tried to force their name in
They
front.
tried to show that they are secular.
Yes.
Then that all our rulers, because they wanted to take our entire Indian population and put it into small watertight boxes. This is the Hindu, this is the Muslim. This is how Hindus behave, this is how Muslims behave. And with that, they created a Hindu architecture and a Muslim architecture, a Hindu culture, Islamic culture, and all that nonsense. And we accepted that without questioning because they were ruling on us and they had colonized our minds. And we continue to believe that. I am not prepared to accept that the imagination of the Mughals was defined by the Quran. Culturally, they were very different from the Arabs. In their religious practice, they followed Islam, but not in their daily life. Because the daily life, their influences were Persian. And the Persians and Arabs have had a very long cultural fight, very long cultural fight. The Arabs had divided the entire world into two kinds of people, the Arabi and the Ajami. And the Ajami were believed to be people who had no language. People who had no language and people who had language. Those who spoke Arabic were the people of the language. Those who did not speak Arabic were the dumb people. And one of the greatest epics written in Persian, the author begins writing that Masnavi by saying, I am writing this poem in the language of the people who have no language. This is how he protested against this idea and the current fight between Saudi and Iran. That is the fight. The Arabs are not prepared to accept that the Persians have a cultural influence on a large territory which Arabs don't have. The fight, which is reduced now to Shia Sunni, has its roots in this cultural division between the Arabs and the Persians. The British insisted to look at Muslims all over the world only from these blinkered views, that all the Muslims have the same outlook to life. We know in our daily practice, the Bengal Muslim and the Tamil Muslim, what do they have in common? Just as the Tamil Hindu and the Bengali Hindu have nothing in common, except for the gods they worship. In this case, even the gods are different.
Yes.
The Bengalis worship Durga and they worship Kartike, you know. So even the religious rituals are not similar. It is the same kind of difference among the Muslims also. So I don't think that this is inspired by the Quran. As far as comparing it to heaven, when you go out with your family, you drive out and suddenly you come across a little brook. If you are saying you are driving in the Darjeeling area, and suddenly you see a small little stream somewhere, and you say, let's camp here, and you say this is like heaven. you know, we are saying it all the time, as if we all of us keep on going to heaven and we know what it is like. A place that we think is the best that we can imagine, we say this is heaven, this is heavenly. This is what the Mughals did. They found a beautiful place and they wrote agar firdaus bar ruhe zaminast haminasto haminasto haminasto. They wrote it in Chartner, they wrote it in Shalimar, they wrote it in Nishat, they wrote it in the Red Fort, wherever. That does not mean that they actually believe that this is inspired by heaven. Thing that please them, they said yes, this is like heaven, we do it all the time. So I don't think the Char Bagh has its origins. And the idea, in any case, you see, even if it is there in the Quran, where did it come from? The four directions, the idea of the four cardinal directions, this is human imagination,
Yes.
which is projected into the Quran, which is also, if you insist, also projected into the garden. It is human imagination. This is not inspired by the Quran. Yeah.
So this was our last question, and we
Okay.
end the lecture over here. But for the audience, I have an announcement for you people. Voices into the Past is organizing a quiz that would be organized on 15th May and 16th May. 15th is our clearance, and in 16th we have the finals. People who want to participate, do fill up the forms. The forms are given in our Facebook page, also in our Instagram page. Do follow those, and it is also being given in the comment section in today's lecture. So if you want to participate, do participate, and there would be cash prizes and certificates for the winner and the runner-up. And the finalists, for all the finalists, there would be e-certificates. We are going to provide that. The registration link is open, so hurry up and fill those forms. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you will send me the recording, please.